We're going to continue to look a bit at that FIFA Women's World Cup. Solange Mijon is in studio to bring us a press review. And Solange, we're seeing a lot of coverage, notably, the smiling faces of those women on the US team. They won it yet again.
Yes, they did. 2-0 against the Dutch team in Lyon last night. And their smiling faces are indeed on papers across the globe today. And perhaps unsurprisingly, those headlines go with a sort of celebratory pics. The pics have a sort of political twang to them. The Independent went with the headline, "Yes, she can," twisting Barack Obama's campaign slogan. And meanwhile, the French paper L'Equipe did the same thing with a Trump slogan. They went with "Great, make America great again." The political undertones that go hand in hand, they actually go hand in hand with who the American team is and who their supporters are, according to the New York Times, which says that few sports teams carry on their shoulders as much meaning as the U.S. women's team because of their global visibility, because of their increasing passion for the sport around the world, and because of their political and gender equality issues that they are fighting for.
Indeed, we saw that come out more and more in this tournament. I mean, the Ballon d'Or player from Norway refused to take part in the tournament. We are seeing movement in the step of that direction, but a lot of those political issues gaining a lot of attention in the reaction to this FIFA World Cup.
Yeah, and in the stands, the rallying cry wasn't just USA, it was equal pay, and that sort of really rung out for people. And the Washington Post explains that 3 months before the World Cup, the tournament team, the U.S. team actually sued the U.S. Soccer Federation for gender discrimination, saying that their working conditions and wages were inferior to the men's team, which doesn't have the sort of same gilded record as the women's does. And the Post says that now that the trophies have been won, the team and world federations like the Amsterdam team need to tackle the issue of how to support women's teams. Now, one columnist in The Atlantic has an idea, albeit a far-fetched one, which is to cancel Qatar. Or the Men's World Cup in 3 years' time. And he says instead, cancel Qatar and instead pay the women. Qatar, he says, it will be, quote, the very opposite of the thrilling spectacle that the Women's Cup was, that it represents, quote, all that is rotten about global football with mass corruption allegations and human rights violations.
Okay, no putting it mildly there. Well, meanwhile, the US women's football team isn't the only one fighting for gender equality. In Sudan, women there fighting to ensure their voices are heard in a new transitional government.
Yeah, after the protest representatives and the opposition came to a tentative deal with the military council for a transitional government, women protesters are fighting too to make sure that they have a place at the table. And Lacroix explains that with the previous breakdown of talks and violence, the issue of gender, of women's rights in Sudan has actually been put on the back burner. And even though women were and are an integral part of the protest movement, and even though they continue to fight to change how they are perceived in Sudanese society.
And that word perceived, somewhat the word of the day in the United Kingdom. Secret cables of the British ambassador to the US have been leaked, and one of them notably about his perception of Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's the Daily Mail that broke this story after it got its hands on secret cables in which Sir Kim Darroch calls Donald Trump, quote, inept, insecure, and dysfunctional, and that his presidency could, quote, crash and burn for a president that is, quote, uniquely dysfunctional with a career that could end in disgrace. An embarrassing leak for the British government as this comes on the heels of Trump's visit there, and one that the Guardian's cartoonist Ben Jennings jumped on, and you have an overweight, junk food eating Donald Trump who is bedbound and yelling into his phone, liar, I am not inept. Ivanka, go and give the UK ambassador a piece of my mind.
Okay, let's turn our attention to Brazil, Solange. An exclusive by the Brazilian edition of The Intercept, which has come out with an investigation into that car wash probe and possible links to Venezuela.
Yeah, the online news site says that the former judge and now Bolsonaro minister, Sergio Moro, was in contact with the car wash anti-corruption probe in 2017. And when he suggested they leak confidential information about the Venezuelan government's alleged participation in the corruption corruption scream, that such a leak would send a political message to the hardening Maduro regime. Now, the Brazilian paper Folha de Sao Paulo says that the task force was sort of hot and cold on the issue, that such a leak would violate the confidentiality agreement that they had, and that qualms over how such a leak would go down in Venezuela. The revelations have led to calls in Brazil for Muro, now Attorney General under Bolsonaro, to resign.
And Jair Bolsonaro, he's also in the news for a different story, supporting child labour.
Yeah, last week he talked about his personal story of starting to work at age 8 and how that has made him who he is, and that work gives men and women dignity regardless of their age, end quote. Pro-child labor comments that the French Huffington Post puts into context some 2.5 million children in Brazil from ages 5 to 17 work in Brazil. And for the opposition on Twitter and on social media, the comments were a lesson of how not to become like Bolsonaro.
Okay, very finally, Solange, you've spotted another story of interest about pigs.
Yes, literal pigs, not the other kind. This is a story about a couple of hikers in Texas who climbed a tree to get away from wild pigs that they thought were chasing them. They called the cops, who then contacted a forest ranger who came. But the forest ranger found no pigs. He just heard the sound of cars, which the hiker said, that's the noise. And it was the sound of cars going over a rumble strip, or the little bumps in the road to tell you you've gotten out of your lane.
Okay.
See.
Solange Frison, thanks a lot for that wrap-up of the international papers. Well, that wraps it up.